So the election was called. We know the result. The Labour Party was elected with another historical win. Do we have to love it? No. Do we have to accept it? Yes, we do. It's called a democracy. Does it mean it's the end of civil society? Well, wouldn't they like that? Today, my talk will be centered around the results, an assessment of the results and the way forward. I know, it's coming out of our noses, but bear with me. I'll give you an executive summary. So, despite 9 long years of scandals, despite a journalist being assassinated and a public inquiry finding that the state was responsible for this murder, the Labour Party remains hugely attractive to voters and was elected by another large majority. There were a startling number of people who didn't vote. The Nationalist Party suffered another defeat. Third parties remained unrepresented in Parliament thanks to distribution of districts. And the success of the gender quota mechanism remains rather questionable. But surprisingly, to me at least, people who crusaded for justice for over 4.5 years did really badly in the polls. Karel Aquilina got in by the skin of his teeth through casual elections. Claudette Buttigieg got in through the gender quota mechanism. Jason Azzopardi, who was involved in most of the cases concerning Daphne Caruana Galizia's assassination, was not elected for the first time in over 20 years. Arnold Cassola, There was Arnold Cassola, who has spent an entire career speaking out against corruption, who also didn't make it to Parliament. But perhaps if the district rules changed, or perhaps if he was a woman and the law was written to be applicable to third parties, he would have made it. I mean, even Everest Bartolo, who sort of criticizes the government in cryptic poems on Facebook, didn't make it to Parliament. But human rights violator Rowan Bonnici did, as did Glenn Bedingfield and Rosiane Cutajar. So what are people saying? That they're fed up? That they're unrepresented? That they were angry about the infighting within the PN? That they don't care about corruption or excessive familiarity between big businesses and politicians? That they don't care if that familiarity leads to the assassination in broad daylight of a journalist outside her home? That they're tired of protests and the misery of hearing about a new scandal on the daily news? Perhaps. A lot of airtime and column inches were dedicated to discussions about how people are tired of an anti-corruption message being shoved down their throats, that people want to live a life in peace and have their needs met. Then the blame game began, and with it, guns turned on civil society, in particular on Robert Aquilina from Repubblica, on Manuel Delia and the Shift News, calling them to disband, to tone it down. Shouts of "Ma titalmu qatt, l-establishment, hemm bżonn ta' ċuħ ġodda," and the usual dreaded accusation of being negativi. I'm also quite fed up of protesting. Believe it or not, I do have other things to do with my Saturdays. But I continue to speak out and to protest and to come here every month because very little has changed. I continue to do so because I am certain that without the pressure put on the government and the police through protests and international lobbying by the likes of Karel Aquilina, Claudette Buttigieg, Therese Comodini Kakia, Jason Azzopardi, Roberta Metsola, David Casa, Repubblica, Occupy Justice, The Shift News, Manuel Delia, NGOs like Graffiti who work non-stop, Arnold Cassola who never gives up, political analysts and countless other members of civil society, but mostly Daphne's own family, very little would have changed at all. Instead of saying, uff, xidwejja kem ħaddumu tipprotestaw u titkellmu fuq il-korruzzjoni, I think we need to turn the tables and ask why, despite the glaring spotlight, it has taken the government so bloody long to clean up its act. We need to ask why it shelters and rewards criminal behavior and why we can't go a single week without hearing of a new scandal eating up taxpayers' funds, public land, or eroding basic democracy. We protest because we are nowhere, and I mean nowhere near where this country should be in terms of democratic standards, and more still, because we are seeing repeat patterns of the same lack of accountability, the same gaslighting, isolation, aggressive media tactics, and that ultimately contributed to a climate that allowed Daphne Caruana Galizia to be assassinated. Even the opposition were suckered in on this point and chose to limit its focus on corruption during this election. They repeatedly spoke about positivity and serenity. I mean, who gave them this advice? Michel Muscat? We have to ask the questions. Who does it pay to have the opposition muted on issues like good governance? Who does it pay to have the opposition stay away from negative news items like the latest government scandal? Who does it pay to remove those waging an anti-corruption crusade from inside of Parliament? Who does it pay to have civil society disbanded and lift all pressure and scrutiny off from the government and their associates? I ask you, who does it pay to blur the lines between the opposition and civil society and blame the latter for the defeat of the former? Who does it pay to paint activism within civil society as a plague of democracy to be treated with hostility and disdain? Ask yourselves. Who does it pay to pressure the independent media into focusing on only nice things like government-approved messages, ponies, and rainbows? Who does it pay? Because to me it seems like there's a recurrent theme in the beneficiaries of this silencing, and if you haven't gotten it, it's the criminals. The machine working to silence civil activism and anti-corruption campaigning is a well-oiled one, because the people behind it have a lot to lose, and yet astonishingly, we seem to be parroting the message. That's not to say I don't agree with arguments that the opposition cannot survive on an anti-corruption message alone. Of course it's important to have an attractive opposition that has vision and worthwhile candidates. Of course it's important to have new candidates and succession planning. Of course it's important to have an opposition that stands for something. But what sort of opposition is it if it drops the ball on good governance? Why does one have to exist without the other? What sort of opposition stops calling out corruption and government wrongdoing because that's negative and no one likes a Debbie Downer, as if Parliament is a dinner party and you're killing the mood? What sort of opposition would it be if it allows something as catastrophic as an assassination of a journalist outside her home and the involvement of the government to be swept under the carpet? I'm sorry, but it's not elitist to want your country to function like a normal democracy and to have basic standards. Of course you have to accept the election result, but accepting the election result does not mean that the government gets to govern without criticism. The two can coexist and they need to coexist. Nor does the opposition get to have a free ride because it's the losing party and it's licking its wounds. It's a constitutional role and it has to be subject to criticism too. And that's how you grow. There's not going to be any change in this country if everyone always says, "Proset Ministru, grazie Ministru." The truth is, civil society and the opposition are not always going to agree on everything, and it's not their role to do so. They don't need to be aligned on every point. They can even disagree on big issues, and that doesn't make them enemies. But ultimately, they should share a common aim, and that is the betterment of this country. That's what should unite them. The idea that if you're not elected in Parliament as a member of the governing party, then you should sit down and shut up is nonsense. It ignores the role the opposition plays, that civil society plays, that the independent media plays, that artists play in the formation and the maintenance of democracy. You don't have to be an elected politician in Parliament in order to contribute to your country. If you love your country, then there's a role for you to play. And that's why we come here. That is why we speak up, even when it is unpopular. The last thing this country needs is less people caring about it. And it isn't a competition. It's not about who the best leader is, which the best NGO is, which the best pressure group is, and who is the best investigative journalist. Everyone has a role to play. And the sooner that we realize it and learn how to harness our strengths and share the workload, the better. Can we do better? Yes. Can our message be improved? Always, and it needs to happen, because the Labour Party is going to be in government for the next 5 years. So despite the drubbing, we're going to have to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off. It seems crazy, but 4.5 years have passed since Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated, and justice still seems to be a long way ahead. We're in it for the long haul. So we need to roll up our sleeves, because there is a lot of work to be done, and we're going to stick around to do it. Thank you.